You can't really exaggerate how grim and crisis-laden conditions are. I walk into the A&E handover in the morning and I see a team who look absolutely broken from the night shift. There are 10 ambulances queuing outside. I might have to have an end-of-life conversation with a patient on a trolley, in a corridor, who doesn't even have a curtain around them.
Welcome back to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that aims to guide you towards a more resilient life and whatever it might throw at you. If this is your first time with us, then please do hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. It really does help make sure that these, I hope, useful conversations are shared as widely as possible. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Clarke, a dedicated palliative care doctor, passionate NHS advocate and best-selling author. One of her books, Breathtaking, which tells the story of the pandemic from the hospital frontline, is now also a hit ITV series. Her new book, The Story of a Heart, looks at death and love from an entirely different and deeply moving perspective. For all of this work, most importantly in the Oxfordshire Hospice and now hospital where she supports and cares for those who are nearing the end of their lives, Rachel has become an important voice and influence on how we approach the subject of death. On this podcast, with guests including grief counsellor Julia Samuel and pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd, we've talked about our approach to what you might describe as the ultimate collective crisis. Rachel, a former journalist, is the perfect person to help us look hard, I think, at how we talk about, or too often fail to talk about, such an important subject. One of the problems we have with death, if you like, is our unwillingness to confront it and make it more a part of mainstream conversation. And having listened to Rachel talk so brilliantly about this subject, she has devoted her entire professional life to in TED Talks and elsewhere, I'm very confident that you'll find what she has to say as thought-provoking and useful. So, Dr. Rachel Clarke, welcome to Crisis What Crisis.
Thank you very much indeed.
How you doing?
Very well.
Good. Well, it's lovely to have you here with us, and thank you for joining us. I said in the intro there that you are an important influence on the death debate, if I can put it that way. But you're more than that, because the writing, the commentary, the advocacy comes second to the day job. And in that day job, you are on the death frontline day after day. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for that work, because palliative doctors aren't really seen as the rock stars of medicine, although they bloody well should be.
We are not. We're definitely the dowdy support act. You want rock star status, go to neurosurgery or cardiothoracic surgery, but
that's all wrong, isn't it?
Well, I think if what you want to do is make a difference, help people, really help patients and their families, then every branch of medicine has the potential to do that. And in palliative medicine, you can transform everything for a patient and their family. And not just in the moment, you can leave a family with a completely different set of memories that they can cherish about the person they have lost who has died. And I think that definitely is a rock star status thing to be able to do. It's definitely something that motivates me so powerfully, literally every day when I go to work in the hospital where I work. I can honestly say I look forward to going to work every day. And not many people can say that these days in the NHS. And it's because I get to do something good and decent in a really simple sense with that patient and this family and the next patient. And I work with an amazing team as well. That helps. But it's an incredible privilege to be able to do that. So I see my job as an absolute privilege.
Because you're doing that now in a hospital as opposed to a hospice, you're doing it in an environment of pretty acute crisis.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Every day.
Yeah,
because you're pulled into any area of the hospital.
Exactly right, Andy. So I used to work in a hospice, beautiful setting, the most gorgeous environment in which to sort of really cherish patients as they approach the end of their life. But in the pandemic, I moved much more into hospital palliative medicine, and I decided to stay there, simply because the need at the moment for palliative care in our NHS hospitals is immense. You can't really exaggerate how grim and crisis-laden conditions are. You know, we all see the news headlines. I walk into the A&E handover in the morning and I see a team who look absolutely broken from the night shift. There are 10 ambulances queuing outside, each with a patient. Some of those patients are dying. They literally can't even get into the hospital. There are patients in corridors, on trolleys. I might have to have an end-of-life conversation with a patient on a trolley, in a corridor, who doesn't even have a curtain around them. It's horrific. It's sort of Dickensian.
This isn't occasional. This is a regular occurrence.
This is how broken the NHS is at the moment. These crisis conditions are the norm now, and it's horrendous. So you roll up your sleeves and you go into this chaotic situation, and it feels like firefighting often. You really have to be on your best possible game as a doctor, because you have patients who are frightened, who are in extremis suffering, families who are distressed, and you have to go into that crisis situation and try and make a difference, do the best job you can. And you can do that, but it's unspeakable how bad conditions are. And I think if people in Britain, if the public knew that there were people suffering at the end of their life in this way that was wholly avoidable, that we could fix if we changed the way we are managing the NHS and funding the NHS, they would want to do that immediately. You wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy, let alone someone you loved.
Okay, so there's two things there that I'd like to talk about a little bit later in the interview. One is how you personally manage those situations that you are sort of immersed in every day. What your sort of approach to crisis management is. Let's get into that. And also I do want to hear what you think the potential, I think solution would be the wrong word. There are no solutions, there's no silver bullet. But how do we start to address, the crisis that you just described in terms of the state of the state of our hospitals? But let's, if you don't mind, as I mentioned in the intro, although you're from a family of medics, I think, you started your professional life actually as a journalist and became a TV producer, working on documentaries about the rise of Al-Qaeda, the Gulf War, conflict in the Congo, also crisis-laden work.
Yes.
You're drawn to it, one might conclude.
I am drawn to crisis, and I'm not sure why that is. No other members of my family are, but I...
Have you thought about why?
Yeah.
What is it?
From a very young age, I mean, even as a kid at junior school, I had this sort of real zeal to make a difference. I wanted to, in a very sort of innocent, immature way, I wanted to do something that would be good, yes, that mattered. And so I sort of went into journalism, partly because I loved writing, partly because I wanted to make a difference, and ended up in current affairs, essentially, and always being drawn to these difficult, challenging stories. And I think there's something so fascinating about throwing a human being into an extreme set of circumstances, a sort of crisis-laden set of circumstances. How do you cope? How do you survive? How do you act when you're tested? Are you going to be courageous? Are you going to run away? Are you going to crumple? And if you're interested in people, as I am to my core, how they cope, how we cope in those situations is just endlessly fascinating. And I think, for me, the heart of good journalism and good medicine is the same. It's this endless curiosity about people and how we behave and what makes our lives worth living and what we do, how we act when the chips are down. So two disparate careers, but actually...
An overlap.
An overlap, yeah.
Tell me about the moment when you decided journalism wasn't actually giving you what you needed?
Yeah, well, there was this... So it grew. I always felt like an imposter as a journalist. I always felt like I was faking being this kind of tough, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and go into the Democratic Republic of Congo and be this brave, tough journalist. But
although that's what you were doing.
That is, yeah, it is what I did.
Just to be clear.
It is literally what I did. But I felt like a bit of a fraud. I always felt like I was faking it, and I always felt very underconfident. I had a big core of imposter syndrome. And I also had ethical problems with journalism because in documentary making, you build up relationships of trust with your interviewees, but then ultimately you end up in a cutting room and your commissioning editor may decide that they want to sex up the story a little bit, and suddenly you're sort of fighting for the integrity of this bond that you've built up, this bond of trust with interviewees. That was hard. And it reached a kind of nadir when Princess Diana was killed in Paris. And I was put onto a fast turnaround documentary that was made in 5 days that went out on ITV. And my job, along with many other people's, was to just phone a list of numbers that I was given and try and persuade this list of names to appear in our documentary. And one of the names was the grandmother of Trevor Rees-Jones, who was Diana's bodyguard in the car crash. And I had to pick up the phone and call this little old lady in Wales and say, I'm so sorry, my name is da-da-da, I'm calling from da-da-da. And this woman sort of wailed down the phone at me. I could hear she was crying. She just wailed, why won't you stop? Why won't you people leave me alone? And I just said, I'm so sorry. And I put the phone down. And I just thought, I don't want to do this. I do not want to do this. That was the moment where I thought, right, I am going to try something different. And all the time I'd regretted not doing medicine. And that was the moment where I thought, damn it, I'm going to get these science A-levels. I'll do them at weekends and at night. I'll apply to med school. I'm just going to go for it.
Astonishing. Do you think that journalistic background, aside from the writing, of course, because you've continued with that so successfully, has it helped you in the job now? Has the sort of scepticism, the cynicism, I should say, perhaps even of being a journalist, is that useful?
Yes, very much so. So I was lucky enough to come into medicine, first of all, with 10 years of age and experience on my shoulders, which I think better equips you to deal with the stresses you're thrown into as a medical student. When I was 18, I'm not sure how I would have coped with slicing into a dead body with a scalpel, seeing somebody die for the first time, all of those things. But also as a journalist, especially if you're trying to make campaigning current affairs documentaries, your whole attitude is whose voices are being heard in this story and whose voices are being silenced, and how do I bring to the fore these stories and these voices of vulnerable people.
And that was a very early thought of yours. So you were quite early on in your medical career making the connection with the journalistic career and thinking, actually, this is something else I can bring to this.
Yes, simply because it was glaringly obvious. I mean, at medical school, you're not even taught about people predominantly. You are taught about essentially diseased body parts. You're going to do the liver. You'll learn 200,000 ways in which the liver goes wrong and many thousand ways you can fix it. Then you'll do the heart, then you'll do blood. Patients are pushed to the margin. And then when you start seeing patients, again, I could see all the ways in which patients' voices are marginalised, are not being heard, are being overlooked. And I vividly remember examples as a medical student of where a sort of very kind of flamboyant Oxford professor would sweep onto a ward and take us to see a patient and get us to examine them and talk to them. And really that human being was being used as not cannon fodder, but med student fodder for our learning. And I would sort of be standing back thinking, where's the consent here? What about what they want and they think? And so very early on, I think that journalistic desire to elevate and advocate for people who are vulnerable, which is something that's very important to me, was there in my medicine. And it's partly why I wanted to specialise in palliative medicine, because all patients are vulnerable. But if you're dying or you have a terminal diagnosis, you're often particularly vulnerable in many, many ways.
What caused you to take the next step then, Rachel, to decide that you would spend your professional life supporting those coming to the end of their lives?
Well, there was another moment of epiphany when I was at medical school, which was hugely influential, and that was my husband, my then fiance's mother, became critically unwell, was rushed into hospital with sepsis, and it turned out that underlying the sepsis, she was riddled with cancer, an undiagnosed cancer, and she was told, and her family were told, it's 50-50 chance she'll survive this. She could die at any time. And I learned this the day before I was doing my end of year first year medical school exams. So as soon as I finished them, I rushed to be with my fiancé Dave and his dad. And they had spent 24 hours in the hospital with Pat. They were exhausted. And I said, well, why don't I sit with Pat tonight, so I'm with her and you can go and get some rest. And that night was one of the longest, hardest, most horrific nights of my life, because she was so desperately unwell and she was suffering, and I could see she was suffering, and I didn't know what to do. I'd only learned biochemistry at that point. I had no practical medical knowledge. So I literally spent the night on the phone to my dad, a retired doctor, saying, Dad, I don't know what to do. These are her symptoms. And my father would say, okay, she needs morphine. You need to speak to the nurses. You need to make them prescribe.
She's on the general ward.
Yeah, she was on a general ward. And I had to advocate for her all night. And in the morning, her doctor, her consultant, appeared and started talking to me about her as though she was already dead. She's probably going to die today, she's probably in her last hours. And I had to say, hang on a second, can we have this conversation outside, please? We didn't know if she could hear or not by that stage. And I said, you have to get the palliative care team involved now, please. She was suffering. And he said, yes, I'll do that later. I'm on my ward round. And my father had said, get the palliative care team involved. So I stood up and said to this consultant and his entourage, no, you will do it now. And I'm not letting you leave until you call this team now. And I probably looked a little crazed by that point, because I had this terrible night, and he sort of made a decision and realised the easiest thing would be to call them. He called them, they came, and within half an hour, they had given her appropriate medications, so she was completely comfortable and relaxed and had dignity, and her pain was addressed. And just after that, her husband and son came and sat with her and had a beautiful half hour with her being completely comfortable before she died with them. And that only happened because of the palliative care team. So I saw directly, and my father in this little chain of events, but I felt then myself what a palliative care team could do. They could take you from utter desperation because there was suffering that we could prevent if this patient was getting better care. They could take you from utter desperation to a death being as peaceful and calm and surrounded by love as it can be. And that's a powerful thing to be able to help.
You were doing that not just with, it wasn't a patient, this is someone you knew. This is someone that you...
Yeah, and...
were very close to, presumably. And
very, and who I had desperately wanted to see us get married. We were getting married a few weeks later. I think it taught me that even though it's hard and painful to be there in that moment, your human presence, me holding her hands, me talking to her, me distracting her, was unimaginably powerful. I was able to do something so positive within the bleakest, darkest set of circumstances. And that's a really important lesson to learn, because we can all do that. Your human presence with someone who's frightened and in pain and suffering and reaching the end of their life is potentially more powerful than any morphine, any drugs. It's the most powerful thing.
So you follow a path then that leads to hospice work, where you spend a number of years working in Oxfordshire Hospice.
Yes.
So not as sort of emergency laden, if you like, because it's not a hospital in the way that you described at the start of our conversation, but a place obviously loaded with emotion. How the emotional side of your work. How do you manage that personally, knowing every day that you're walking into those most difficult circumstances for the people that you're treating?
Yes. Well, I think one important reason that a lot of people probably might not imagine is the fact that in a hospice, which you might assume is a sort of bleak, dark, utterly depressing place, there is actually more of what is good and important in life than I think perhaps any other setting. All the things that make our lives worth living, the love of people around us, the joy of tiny things, sunshine on your cheek, bird song, eating a little bit of a delicious smoothie that the housekeeping staff have knocked up for you that morning. All of those things are there, but you savor them so much more intensely if you know that your time is running out. And Dennis Potter, the playwright, famously talked about this on stage many years ago in conversation with Melvyn Bragg, where he talked about looking out of his window. He was dying of pancreatic cancer and he could see the blossom in the apple trees. And he said, it's the blossomiest blossom that he had ever seen. He was enraptured by the beautiful nowness of life, as he described it. And the nowness of life is just super saturates everything in a hospice. And also, for all the distress and grief that, of course, is there in a hospice, you see the absolute best qualities of human beings in abundance. You see people being so courageous, so brave, so kind, so selfless, so astonishingly dignified, so full of grace. And God knows we need more of that in the world. It's easy to read the news headlines and think everything is bad in the world. But in a hospice setting, you actually see more of the beautiful, good stuff. You see a patient who is frightened, who knows they're dying, but only cares about the family they love. You see the family, hearts breaking with grief, only caring about acting in a way that cherishes their loved one who's dying. That's the world I work in. So I take that psychologically kind of with me when I leave at the end of the day. I think to myself, I may have witnessed something just utterly heartbreaking, particularly if there were children involved. You know, I'll often have conversations with young children about mummy or daddy dying. It's heartbreaking, but I also see the absolute best of people. And I'm reminded of all the beautiful, precious, everyday moments that make life worth living.
So you're able, if you like, to focus on the very eloquently, beautifully described kind of emotional impact that you have in your work, but you're able just to kind of take the positives with you when you arrive home, walk through the front door into your own family, normal life continues, everything that goes on in life you get on with, carrying all of this emotion with you. You're able to kind of filter out and just retain the positivity. It's
my belief that we can't really filter anything out. If you try and suppress something, it just festers. And I think that being a human being is spectacularly hard. We are the one living creature that knows we are mortal. Of course, it's daunting to confront mortality, because mortality means losing that which we love. And the more you love, the more you are opening yourself up to the savage pain of grief. Instead of trying to suppress that, I try and swim through it, if that makes sense. I know that both.
How do you manage that on the day-to-day? I mean, in the hospice setting in particular, you're getting to know these people pretty well, right?
Well,
you're becoming quite close to your patients in a way that most doctors don't.
Yes,
right?
You come to know them very, very well. And even if you know them for a short amount of time, the intensity of the conversations you have cause a real bond.
Bring you very close to them very quickly. Yeah.
I allow myself to cry. So at work, I will be hard as nails in the sense that my emotions don't matter. The emotions of my patient and my family are what matters. So I will not indulge my emotions in a way that stops me doing a difficult job. I've got to do it as well as possible. If I'm talking to a 6-year-old about mummy dying, I'm not going to allow my emotions to get in the way of having that conversation as well as I possibly can. But then I'll go and have a cry with my members of my team. We all do that sometimes. We know that we need to look after each other. And I don't mind if I'll sit in the staff car park and cry for a bit before driving home, because that's human. That's a natural reaction to the unavoidable suffering that's a part of being a human being.
How often do you find yourself at the end of a day's work sat in your car?
Well, during the pandemic, every day. Because the scale of the dying was immense. I'll definitely do that maybe, once a week. But I'm also an incredibly happy, positive person. And there's this wonderful quote from Ted Hughes in a letter he wrote to his son, which is something I sort of carry around in my emotional backpack. And he said, the only calibration that counts is how much heart you invest. So how much you're willing to take a risk with yourself, be bold, be brave, sort of put yourself out there. And he said the only thing people regret is that they didn't invest enough heart, they didn't live boldly enough, they didn't love enough. And I think that's really true. The more we invest of ourselves, the more we open ourselves up to pain and humiliation. But really, is there any other way to live? The only other way to live is to build up barricades and not invest your heart in anything, and that's just a horrendous way to live. So I'm a Ted Hughesian. I want to go out there and put myself out there and connect as much as I can, and know that there's a cost to that, but it's the only way to live.
Beautifully put. Julia Samuel, who I know you know, amazing lady.
Yes.
Came onto the podcast, and we had a conversation with her about how she handles those real moments of trauma when she's deep in the most difficult of conversations. And there's a theory in her world, of course, that you should never cry with your patients. You've cried with your patients as well. You're careful about it, as in the way that you've described.
Yes, but occasionally that's okay, because a doctor is a human being too. And I can give you an example, actually, where... So sometimes you can make an immense difference through something incredibly small at the end of someone's life. And we can all do this. It doesn't require medical training. And one of the things I love to offer a patient in hospital when they're dying, or a family with a patient, is alcohol, because alcohol is one of the ways in which some of us sort of mark a celebration, an event of significance. And I remember once caring for a patient, a young-ish man, who knew I had to tell him he was in the last hours of his life with his family. Literally, I had to convey that information, shattering information. And we were talking, and I asked if anything would he like me to get him anything that might make a difference? And he sort of couldn't think of anything. And I said, for example, this may sound really, really odd, but could you do with a drink right now? Do we like a drink, some of us, when we're shocked or upset? And he said, yeah, I could do with a drink. And I said, right, what's your favourite? What do you fancy? He said, well, Southern Comfort on ice, please. I said, all right, coming up. And our palliative care ward coordinator, I phoned her up and said, can you go to Sainsbury's? We need a bag of ice, Southern Comfort, and a glass. We've got to have glasses, not NHS plastic beakers. So she rushed off and got this stuff, and we were able to give him and his family Southern Comfort, bottle of Southern Comfort, bag of ice, and these sort of cut glass tumblers. And of course it meant everything. We couldn't change the big picture that was horrific, but we had done something that actually made this young man laugh and smile, and his family adored it. And I remember crying while arranging this, because it was kind of everything and nothing simultaneously. And his family were crying, he was crying, and we all hugged. And it just felt like in that moment, my emotion was my way of saying, I am so sorry, I care about you, I hate that this terrible thing is happening to you, and I wish it wasn't. And I think that is often what tears represent. We're afraid of crying when our friend tells us they have terminal cancer. I would suggest don't be afraid. If you cry, that's your way of telling your friend that you love them and you don't want a bad thing to happen with them. Just say, you can say, I'm sorry, but I'm crying because I love you and I don't want this to happen. And that often is all someone needs to hear.
Has your writing provided some release, would you say, from the tougher aspects of your job? The fact that you're able to tell such moving stories provide a bit of comfort for you, as well as the families who you write about?
For me, writing is a way of understanding, thinking, processing events. I sometimes don't discover what I really think or feel about something until I write it down. That's how I discover what it's distilled into for me. So it's incredibly helpful. It's a reflective process. And I think also the challenge of taking a kind of messy, chaotic situation or story and trying to impose a story and discipline on it and find the meaning within it is a really powerful and rewarding enterprise. And I think for me that process is almost a way of reclaiming some order from the chaos and crisis of everyday work as a palliative care doctor. But
the writing is part of your personal crisis management.
I write all the time. I even if it's just a few little notes, because I'm very tired at the end of the day. I love writing, and I think I manage crisis points at work, in life, through talking to other people about them, through writing about them, and somehow looking directly at them, trying not to flinch from them. I think when I was younger, I definitely used denial as a strategy. I would pretend that X was not happening because it was unbearable, so I just had to build up a wall between me and X. And now I think I know that that's just hopeless, that way lies madness, and it's what you need to do is confront things. You have to look at the sun even though the sun is burning your eyes.
It's interesting though, because the NHS is becoming, perhaps this is part of the problem, I don't know, you'll have a much clearer view than me, that there aren't enough people kind of looking you in the eye, if I can put it that way. I don't mean in terms of the doctors or the nurses, but we have this kind of, we're not confronting the truth of the NHS, are we?
No.
We're kind of shying away from what is a fundamental truth about our NHS, which is it's not fit for purpose anymore.
It isn't fit for purpose, and actually, I don't want to stray into sort of party politics, but the new health secretary, Wes Streeting, one of the first things he did was say, the NHS is broken, it is in crisis, and this is calamitous, and we have got to fix this. And I was really delighted that he said that, because it's just empty pretense, pretending otherwise. That doesn't help anybody. The NHS is in crisis, and whatever...
Has been for a very long time.
Yeah. And, you know, there's a really simple bottom line here, which is a country gets the health service it is willing to pay for. And if you want a world-class health service, you pay for it one way or another. I favour general taxation. Some people favour insurance, you know, but you have to pay for it. And there isn't really a shortcut. And I think at the moment, the very fact that we as individuals are good at pretending the bolts from the blue are never going to happen to us. You know, I know cancer's out there, but I'm never going to get cancer. I know that horrible car crashes are out there, but I'm never going to have a horrible car crash and suddenly need hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of NHS care. The very fact that we are good at denying that truth is one of the things that is causing the NHS to fail. You know, we all know that it's falling apart. We know that the ambulances are stacked up outside A&E, but unless you personally have been there or you know someone who has suffered that, we just put one foot in front of the other and sort of pretend it's not ever going to be relevant to us. And of course it is. 1 in 2 of us will get cancer in our lifetimes, for example. So statistically, there's a very good chance it will happen to you.
What about some of the other uncomfortable truths around health? What about the sort of, personal responsibility debate in the midst of this?
Yes. So the personal responsibility debate is a really important one that I think is often misused. For example, you know, fat shaming people, which happens a lot, or shaming people because they smoke or they have a bad diet or they don't exercise, all of the things that we should do but don't do as much as we should. If you shame people for those things, it's not going to encourage them to change their behaviour. It's not going to engender healthier lifestyles. In fact, it's probably likely to make that individual worse, because they won't want to see a doctor or present if they're only going to come away feeling ashamed. So I think, of course, we all need to be healthier as a population and as individuals. That's about personal responsibility. But it's also the case that it is easier to have a healthier lifestyle if certain things apply. If you are wealthy enough to afford your 5 a day or your 30 different fruit and vegetables a week, then you're more likely to have a healthy diet. It is much, much cheaper to buy a McDonald's and fill up yourself and your kids on tasty, delicious and sort of nutrition-free McDonald's than it is to buy expensive kind of guava and chia seeds and, you know, quinoa, whatever it is, your nice middle-class sort of Waitrose supermarket basket, and spend 2 hours rustling up whatever those ingredients would make. And if you're time poor, if you're money poor, if you're working 3 jobs to make ends meet, how do you have time to go running, buy nice, healthy food?
And if you're unlucky enough to live in a certain part of the country.
Exactly. You know, the socio-economic gradients in health are just immense. If you're poor in Britain, you're more likely to get sick, you are more likely to die, to a staggering extent.
It is undeniable, yeah.
If we're serious about health promotion and preventing ill health, we need to tackle the root causes. So we need to go for the drinks industry, the food industry, who spend billions of pounds in Britain pushing and enticing us into buying their crap, unhealthy, disgusting, unnutritious food. So if you want to make a difference, the NHS can't do it all. We've got to be regulating that.
Let's get back to your book. the story of a heart. You've touched on it. Gives us another perspective on death. It's about a 9-year-old girl, Kira, who lost her life in a car accident, I think.
Yes.
And whose heart was donated to save the life of a 9-year-old boy. His name is Max. The story of two families linked by one heart, as it rather brilliantly says on the cover of your book. What made you feel like you needed to properly investigate this story? Because that's essentially what you've done. You've talked to everyone involved, the families obviously, but also the medics, everyone kind of involved in this astonishing story.
Yes. Well, when I was a medical student, I found the idea of organ transplantation just mind-blowing. I knew I'd never be a surgeon. I would definitely kill anyone I operated on. I'm really clumsy and klutzy. But I was transfixed by this idea that you could take an organ from somebody whose brain had died but whose body was still living, and you could use it to save another life. And the idea that you could pluck from a horrific set of circumstances, the sudden unexpected death of a loved one, you could pluck from that this incredible legacy and afterlife of saving multiple other lives, was really fascinating. And then years later, I came across this story because the face of Max popped up on the front page of the Mirror newspaper. He'd been waiting nearly a year for a donor heart. And this face was just, he was so pale, he was ghostly, had white blonde hair, and he looked like a boy who was dying. He was a boy who was dying. And he was part of a Mirror campaign to change the law around organ donation to encourage more people to donate. And then I couldn't believe it when a few months later, Max popped up again on my news feed. This was in the days when X was called Twitter and was still a reliable source of breaking news, unlike now. Thank you, Elon. And he popped up again, and now his face was pink and beautiful and vivacious because he had got a heart. And then because of the publicity, something unprecedented happened. Normally, a donor family never meets the recipient family. It's really important that they stay apart. But because of the publicity, the two families worked out who they were. And Kira's family, so her parents and her siblings, met Max and his family, and with a stethoscope listened to her heart beating in his chest. And they had this astonishing just generosity of spirit in these awful moments of being told that she was brain dead and she couldn't recover. They made the decision to donate her organs, and this culminated in that moment of hearing her heart beat on. And I just thought that's the most extraordinary story I have ever heard. And I longed to tell that story because for me, it encapsulated everything. What a dream to write about that.
So we've got a flavour in this conversation of what your day job is like. All right, you're now working in hospital, not in a hospice, as I say, acute, kind of a crisis-laden environment. You are going home at night and thinking about stories like this and then sitting at your laptop and writing books. We've talked a bit about how that helps you, the therapeutic side of it, but there's another motive that sits behind this, isn't there?
Yes.
This is a bit of a mission as well, isn't it?
Yes.
And I alluded to it in the intro. You are a very important voice on the subject of death and how we discuss it, how we handle it, how we manage it. That's what this is about, is it?
Absolutely. I think like many people who work in palliative medicine, I see part of my job, the job of my life, as trying to encourage people to have a conversation about this really daunting topic, our mortality, death and dying. I would never pretend it's easy to do that. I think it's a bit arrogant, actually, and sort of making too many assumptions to assume people find it easy to talk about death and dying. Many people don't. But if I can help encourage people to look at our mortality and talk about death and dying, I hope I can do some good in a sort of broad public sense as a doctor. For example, I don't know, Andy, if you have ever talked to your family, people you love, about advanced care planning, what's important to you at the end of your life. It's a conversation many people don't have. They think it's morbid. But if you just spend 2 minutes having that conversation with the people you love, now you know their wishes. So if the worst happens and the doctor says to you at 3 a.m, your mum has had a catastrophic stroke, we don't know if she is going to wake up, but if she does, she's likely to be severely brain damaged. Do you have any idea what she might have felt about that? How awful if you have no idea. It's too late.
And you've seen that time and time
again. Whereas all you need to do is make a cup of tea and say, Mum, bit morbid, but I want to talk about this because I need to know your wishes. I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me what matters. Let's talk about it. Then you now have vital information that can help the person you love be the author of the end of their life. And that's so important. So I don't want any heroics if I'm severely brain damaged. And what I really want as part of my advanced care plan is I want to see an otter in the wild before I die. And that is, I'm obsessed with otters. I've never seen one in the wild, despite getting up at 5 a.m. in the Highlands of Scotland and trying very hard.
Right.
So even if I'm, having chemotherapy and close to death, I want to be wrapped up in a duvet and I want someone to take me somewhere where I can see a bloody otter in the wild before I die. And those are really my two things. No heroics if I'm severely brain damaged, and please get me to an otter. So we can all have that conversation.
That's going to be a challenge, by the way, for whoever's tasked with that.
Palliative care is all about challenges. We once got a prize-winning bull smuggled onto the hospital premises because a farmer wanted to see his bull before he died. It did break a lot of health and safety rules, but we figured...
But you did it.
No one needed to know. Yeah, a tractor came all the way through the hospital car parks, round to the hospice at the back of the hospital with a large prize-winning bull.
Wonderful.
We quite like breaking the rules in palliative care.
Your book, Breathtaking, but also the TV series that came as a result, is another one of those little arrows that you sent out in this debate, isn't it? Yes.
Unbeknownst to ITV and Jed Mercurio, I had a secret agenda when we were writing the screenplays for Breathtaking and all the way through the filming. My secret agenda was to use the ITV drama Breathtaking as a golden opportunity to stimulate a public discussion around death and dying on a national level. So 6 million people watch the series, so this is a great-sized conversation. If you go back and watch the series, at every opportunity, the main characters are having conversations where they're saying things like, I'm afraid I have to tell you that Mrs. Smith is sick enough to die, a phrase that is not used often enough in hospital, or please can you tell me what really matters to Mr. Smith, because I want to do all I can to ensure that we are giving him these opportunities, these experiences at the end of his life. So at every moment possible in the script, I wrote in these examples of advanced care planning, having clear, compassionate conversations around death and dying, in the hope that it might encourage the British public to feel a bit less intimidated about those conversations themselves.
You're a one-woman public information campaign.
Totally, and luckily, they all slipped under the radar. And at no point did Jed say to me, why is the main character again saying, what matters to you? What's really important to you at the end of your life? And every patient above their bed in the drama has a little, a sort of little notice board that says, what matters to me? And then it says, my children, my religion. And this was all deliberate, designed to try and encourage that conversation. Because
brilliant work. That phrase you used earlier, you're sick enough to die. Just explain to me why that particular phrasing is important.
So it's really important to communicate clearly and compassionately. I think sometimes doctors are afraid that if they use the word death, it's a callous word. But what's callous is how you say something, not the word itself. So if I say, I'm very, very sorry to have to tell you that your daughter is very unwell at the moment and she's sick enough to die, if I say that compassionately, I'm not conveying any kind of callousness at all, but I'm being honest. And if I don't make that clear, I'm potentially removing from that family the chance to say the things they want to say to their daughter, be with their daughter. I'm denying them the opportunity to think about that information and decide how to act on it. And the other thing that's really helpful for people is if we give parameters. So sometimes a question people will ask almost more often than anything else is, how long do they have? How long before my daughter dies? And a lot of doctors will say, I don't know. And that's not very helpful. What I'll tend to say is the best guide we have is how quickly someone's changing. So if someone is deteriorating slowly month by month, we think a number of months, week by week, a number of weeks, day by day. Sometimes someone is changing hour by hour, and that's when we suspect they're in their last hours of life.
It just strikes me listening to you, there really aren't many jobs. This is possibly the only job where every word you're uttering, never mind the things that you are doing, but every word you're uttering has impact.
Yes.
You can't,
Yes.
as we all do in our working lives, drop our shoulders, relax a bit, have a bad day. Kind of, not really think about what we're saying or what we're writing or how we're behaving.
Yes.
We all do that every day in our working lives. You can't really do that, can you?
No, you can't. And sometimes I say, if I'm teaching medical students or junior doctors about palliative medicine, which I love to do, I will say, and I truly believe that there are times in my job, my specialty, where what I'm trying to do verbally feels every bit as laden with risk and responsibility as the slice of the scalpel held by the neurosurgeon through someone's brain.
Absolutely.
But of course, if you can get that right, it's incredibly fulfilling work.
Incredibly important work. So I'm going to say thank you again. Some of the most, frankly, difficult to read passages in Breathtaking are focused on the enforced separation between those who are dying and their families, which was, something we all remember from the pandemic. And the incredible lengths that you and your colleagues would go to ensure that those in their final hours, knew they were loved, essentially. The memory of the pandemic is fading fast, it seems, for most of us. For you, I suspect those memories are some of the most impactful, emotional, difficult that you have.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting when Breathtaking came out on ITV earlier this year, there was the most astonishing outpouring of responses from NHS and care staff who sometimes found it too traumatic to watch, sometimes watched it and just said, my God, thank you for putting that on screen, because that was my life. And all we wanted to do was show the public what it was really like. There's been so much misinformation and, politicising of all the decisions around the pandemic. But there was this core, this heart of it was this deeply traumatic collective experience for all the healthcare staff involved. And I think probably the hardest aspect of the pandemic was the knowledge. And I remember thinking this with the very first patient with COVID I encountered in hospital. I realised that this patient in front of me was an elderly gentleman and I could see he was dying. And I realised that he and every other patient with COVID I was going to see, from the moment they came into hospital, they were never, ever going to see another human face again. Every face they saw would be masked, so they wouldn't see my lips, my smile. They would see someone who was barricaded behind masks and visors and all the PPE. And the inhumanity of that was so striking. When any of us are frightened or in pain, we want tactile support from people who care about us. We want care around us. And these barriers between us and our patients were awful. And the biggest barrier of all between patients and their loved ones was just heartbreaking, necessary because of infection control, but to not have loved ones, sons, daughters, husbands, wives there at the bedside of these frightened patients was utterly, utterly heartbreaking. And we were just determined to do whatever we could to cross those barriers. And with this first patient I've just mentioned, I remember holding his hand through my gloved hands, because even though my flesh was not touching his flesh, the heat of my healthy, warm hands was suffusing into his icy cold hand. And I hoped that maybe somehow he would feel that I was kind of giving him my literal human warmth, even though he couldn't see my face. But it was incredibly hard, because most people who work in healthcare, their instinct is to move towards people who are suffering and try and help them. And for the first time in my history as a doctor, that instinct was counterbalanced by all the ways in which you were being pushed away and sort of barricaded from patients. And it was really, really hard.
From this distance, how do you now view the pandemic, that whole period? When you look, you've had the inquiries, it's been politicised in the way that you say, it's still kicked around as an issue.
Yeah.
But it's also fading fast, as I mentioned, in people's memories. How does that make you feel?
I think it is human nature to want to forget things that are traumatic. We're really good at stuffing away in our sort of psychological back pockets the things that have traumatised us. It is hard to live with traumatic experiences, and I think that the entire country was traumatised during COVID. We all lost something in COVID. At one end of the spectrum, people lost their lives, they lost the people they loved. But even the best case scenario, you still lost your freedom to go outside and live your life as you wanted. You still had to wear a mask. You were still a kid who didn't get to go to school. Everybody lost something. It was traumatic for everybody. And I think it's really important to try to do with a pandemic what a good doctor tries to do with a patient and their family. It's to look at it, don't flinch away, and try to be honest about the causes. So it's not helpful to politicise the decision-making. Some of the decisions were wrong at the start. Of course they were wrong. It was a global pandemic. No one knew what they were doing. We didn't understand the disease. We thought it was a disease of the lungs. It's a disease of the whole body. I wouldn't have wanted to be Boris Johnson. I wouldn't want to be Prime Minister in a crisis like that. How terrifying, working out what to do. The one thing you can do that's positive is learn from the mistakes. Don't use mistakes to browbeat the other side. Let's learn from the mistakes.
Are you concerned that we're not learning, or that we haven't learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm somebody who, for having the temerity to say two things on social media: one, COVID is a real, dangerous, serious disease, and two, vaccines are going to have a very good chance of saving your life. For being pro-vaccine and pro-acknowledging that COVID's a real disease, I've been subjected to years of the most unspeakable abuse on social media, including death threats, rape threats, threats against my family, and a sort of constant stream of bile, just astonishing abuse. And that's just hideous. What that says about, how can, through the pandemic, how can we have reached a point where NHS staff were being abused for saying this is a real disease. I don't understand that. I can't understand that people really believe COVID doesn't exist and more people died from COVID vaccines than the disease itself. That says something very scary about modern society and the flow of information and what information is believed in modern society.
And your view is that that's not a collection of, idiots who sit on the sidelines. You continue to be concerned that sits somewhere in the mainstream.
I know it sits somewhere in the mainstream because I see the actual real-world results of that. So, for example, during the pandemic, young pregnant women dying of COVID in intensive care who had chosen not to have a COVID vaccine because they were so frightened of the disinformation they were reading. Or I've met more than one patient with cancer, so immunosuppressed, incredibly vulnerable to getting serious COVID, life-threatening COVID, refusing to have a vaccine because they are so convinced that the disinformation is true. So that's why I think there's a special place in hell for those individuals who deliberately set out to pollute public discourse by spreading anti-vax disinformation, because the real-world consequences of that is, a pregnant woman dying, having to have an emergency caesarean section on a ventilator with COVID in A&E, so her baby survives and then she dies because she was too scared to have a vaccine.
Before I let you go, can I just sort of dig away a little bit more at your operating system? How do you sort of organise yourself to be able to take on, we've touched on the kind of emotional weight that you carry with the work that you do now in hospital. You've got this public side as well. You're also incredibly productive. Where's all this energy come from, Rachel? How do you organise yourself? You're a wife. You're a mother.
Yeah.
It's a marvel. So give us a clue.
Well, I'm a really obsessive person. When I get the bit between my teeth, when I think something's important and it matters, I'm totally obsessive about pursuing it to the bitter end, and I have a lot of energy and desire to do that. I think I try really hard to carve out time for family, and I don't waste time. I can't bear wasting time of any kind. Like, I'm always doing something. I have a compulsion to always be doing something that I feel is productive. I find it very difficult to lie on a beach or, laze around. We get one life. It's one spark in this immense darkness, and then it's gone. So I just want to savour every moment and make the most of it. And I don't care about most things. I don't care about riches and status and a big fancy house. I care about the stuff that I see my patients caring about on their deathbed. And in the end, it boils down to one thing. It's just love. It's just the people they love and wanting them to be around them. That's the only thing that matters. That's the only legacy that matters. And that's how I try to live my life.
Rachel, it's just wonderful. You're a woman who doesn't like to waste time. I'm very glad that you gave us some of yours today. So thank you for joining us.
Real pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, then please do leave us a review. And if you found it helpful or even inspiring, we'd be delighted if you recommended us to your friends. You can watch the full episodes on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and TikTok. And if you hit subscribe, you'll find a lot more crisis conversations. As always, full transcripts are available on our website along with links. Just head to crisiswhatcrisis.com. And thanks so much for listening.